Hi everyone, my name is Jordan Marshall and I'm the Chief Reporter at Building Magazine. I'm really excited about today's webinar, which is an in conversation with Ron Lang, who's the Impact Director for Value at the Construction Innovation Hub. Today's a really important day in the life of the Hub's Value Toolkit. It's the launch of the next phase of in the program for that. So I'm really excited to be able to have a chat with Ron about what that means, how we've got to this point with the product so far, and what the industry needs to do to embrace it moving forward. So first of all, I'd like to welcome Ron. Hi. Thanks so much for having time today.
No, thanks for inviting me along.
And secondly, I was just hoping you might be able to run us briefly through your role at the Hub and your role in creating this Value Toolkit.
Yeah, sure, thank you. So I'm the Impact Director for Value for the Construction Innovation Hub. So what that means is I'm responsible for the value aspects of our program and making sure that we are doing and working on things that are going to be impactful for the sector, making sure that we are spending that public funds wisely.
Brilliant. Okay. Okay. So I suppose, as we've said, today is a big day for the Value Toolkit. Would you sort of be able to tell us why that is? Why is today such an important day in the program?
Yeah, absolutely. It feels a bit like a birthday in some ways. So the work that we've done on the Value Toolkit actually stretches back quite far. So many of the people on the call today will probably be involved in what used to be called Procuring for Value, which was an initiative via the Construction Leadership Council. But in the summer of 2019, the Hub were asked to take forward that work and to develop some practical tools and processes to actually support value-based decision making. So all in all, we've been working on this for quite some time, but actually this really started to accelerate last July. So when the pandemic had been around for a few months and people realized that this wasn't going away, we were asked to accelerate this work quite considerably. So we spent the last 9 months working intensively with people across the sector to bring this into life. So it doesn't feel like long, 9 months, it's gone in a flash. There's a huge amount of work and enthusiasm gone into this. So it's a really big day for us.
I suppose, as you say, the past 9 months are not a typical 9 months either.
No.
How has that sort of played into the development to getting to this point? Obviously, the way the world has been different in the past 9 months.
Yeah, I think it's testament to the way we've managed to embrace technology. So I've met literally hundreds of people that I've never physically met. So we're on calls with different clients, different experts from across the sector every day, but we've really been able to collaborate. And I think it's given people some space, some headspace to really start to push some of these things. And obviously to get stuck into something that everybody really believes in. So I genuinely think we've created a movement. I think the movement already existed and we've somewhat accelerated that.
So in saying that, like you said, it's been a long time coming. It's being backed by previous bits of work, and this is a continuation of things that were already happening in the industry. But could you sort of outline briefly for everyone what exactly the Value Toolkit is? I mean, I know there's a lot to it, but just a sort of overview for everybody who's on the call today.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a good place to start, Jordan. You're right. So the Value Toolkit is effectively, first and foremost, it's a process. It's a new approach. So what the Value Toolkit does is sets out a series of activities that we want clients to do with their teams on projects and programs to make sure they're embedding what we call value-based decision making. This is the premise that we need to start to move very rapidly beyond lowest cost and inputs and outputs and towards looking for better outcomes for society, environment, and of course for the economy too. So really it's, as you'll see from the web link that we'll share during this call, it sets out 5 streams of activity. So the first stream of activity, which is really the core of the Value Toolkit, is around value definition. So as part of the construction sector deal and the industrial strategy, for those who remember that all those couple of years ago, there was an ask in there for a more consistent view on what value really means in the built environment. So the value definition stream of the Value Toolkit really focuses on that. How can we provide common framework and common language for clients to be able to help them to express what they actually mean by value? The second stream is around risk. So we need to start this paradigm shift away from risk being about time and cost and towards risk being risk of not achieving those broader outcomes that we desire. We've then got a stream called client approach. This acknowledges the fact that a clear definition of value is fine, but unless we're going to change our approach to delivery, we're very unlikely to be able to leverage those broader outcomes. So we're looking at making sure we select the right delivery model, making sure we develop the right commercial strategy to be able to support an outcome-driven project or program. Then we move into measurement and evaluation. A clear definition of value, again, is fantastic, but unless we've got ways to measure different options and different solutions against that definition of value, then we can't really make the right, most informed choices. So the evaluation and measurement module is about how we, stream is about how we develop that robust approach to measurement and make sure that we can actually compare things, apples with pears in some respects. These are very different solutions which will leverage different types of value. And then finally, we have a stream which is associated with appointments. This acknowledges that actually this is all about people. So how do we make sure we get the right people in the room with clients at the right time during a project or a program to actually help them to make the right decisions? So effectively, that's the Value Toolkit, 5 streams of activity and a process to help the client to answer really key questions along the journey of a project or a program.
So it's really like imperative that it's something that can be used the whole way through the life cycle of a project and built asset, I suppose, as opposed to just one stage.
Yeah, absolutely. And the earlier the better. So we've already learned from a lot of testing we've done to date about how we make sure that we have these conversations early. It's too late often. So the reason that, or one of the reasons that it's no longer termed procuring for value is that this isn't just about that procurement transaction. This is about the decisions we make all the way along the journey from the very earliest stage. Do we even need to build anything to solve the problem we're trying to solve? Do we actually have a need that we can address through building something? So the earlier the better, absolutely. And of course, the broadest range of possible projects and programs and clients. And then finally, there's another level to this. So some of those tools and those processes I've mentioned can also be used at higher portfolio levels. How do we get clients to start to think about value across their portfolio of assets? How do we make sure they're leveraging the best for the management of those assets, from refurbishment of those assets to knocking them down, new ones, all the rest of it. So we're really looking at lots of different levels as to how we can apply the toolkit. But first and foremost, that end-to-end journey from a project or program, from the very start to the actual operational life cycle, is where we're trying to target the Value Toolkit.
Okay, perfect. Also, I just want to jump in quickly and let our audience know that please at any point feel free to jump in with your questions in the chat, and I'll try and get as many of those answered by Ron while we have this opportunity to have him here with us, because I've got 100 questions, but I am sure plenty of you do as well. So it'd be great to get some of those covered off for you if we can. So I suppose we've touched on how obviously it's an interesting time for the world as a whole, but it's a particularly interesting time for construction with the government having this really, building back better agenda. How does the toolkit how do you envisage the toolkit sort of playing into that agenda in terms of delivering on government policy?
Yeah, so I mentioned this this acceleration we had about 9 months ago. This was a recognition that we knew that when we came out the other side of the pandemic, we would need to make sure that we were using that opportunity to build back better. So the whole phrase "build back better" makes a lot of sense when we talk about the Value Toolkit. There is a tendency for people to revert immediately back to the status quo and to start to throw money into infrastructure in the built environment. But of course, we've seen people's attitudes through this pandemic change. People expect better now. They expect more. They expect to use this opportunity to reset, if you like, our compass around what is right and what is wrong and how we make decisions. So this is about how we emerge from the pandemic in a better state than we entered it. And of course, we've heard this before when we think about the global financial crisis a few years ago. We perhaps didn't take the opportunity that the reset gave us to actually come out in a better way. So there's also another aspect to this. So how do we make our money work harder? So this is about if we're going to make such huge investments in the built environment, which is of course very much needed, how do we use that to address things like social inequality or rebalancing the economy, addressing climate change, of course? How do we build more adaptable, resilient assets? And in some respects, how do we prepare ourselves through the environment to deal with crises like the one we've just experienced or still experiencing in many, many ways? So we're actually better placed for it later. We've learned a huge amount about how resilient our assets are to this new way of living, for example. But there's also the immediate issues left by the pandemic. So how do we support those communities hardest hit by the pandemic? Can we do something in who we employ to build our projects? Can we make sure we're upskilling them and giving them new capabilities? Can we focus on where we're sourcing materials from to help those communities emerge from this crisis in a much better state? So the Value Toolkit tries to do all that. It tries to help a client to consider all these different things and to build them into a project or program so they're right at the heart of the decision-making process.
And I suppose that sort of fits into what you were saying about the whole module around the idea of like that definition of what value is. And it's not just about economic cost, and it's not just about lowest price. And in fact, I think it's about the opposite of that, lowest price not being the indicator of best value. But what I was going to ask is, you gave us an overview of that module, but how does it really drive that deeper understanding of what value is for a client? How does the toolkit enable that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think I try to think about day-to-day life. It's becoming increasingly difficult for all of us to make value-based decisions. So couple of cheesy analogies if you'll bear with me for a second. So the first one is supermarket shopping, and some of the people on the call will have heard me talk about this before. But we used to go into the supermarket, and if you think about fruit and vegetables, for example, it was easy to make a choice between fair trade, if it fit within your budget envelope, of course, to choose between fair trade and perhaps non-fair trade goods. The issue now is you go in and some of those fair trade products are wrapped in plastic. And you say, well, hang on a minute, so I've got a kind of value driver around fair trade, but I've also got a value driver around minimizing plastic in the environment. That's a really simple example of how difficult it is to make decisions. Similarly, I bought some trainers recently. I was really hell-bent on making sure I got trainers with recycled content, all that kind of stuff, trying to live and practice the what I preach effectively. But I didn't know where they were made, so I'm making judgment based on the materials and what it was, but who made those trainers and where did they come from and all that. So it's two really simple examples of how difficult this is becoming. So what the Value Toolkit tries to do is not to tell anybody, not to tell any client what value is, but to give them a framework to help them to consider that themselves. So we've been working with a huge number of experts to develop what we call a value definition framework. So when we talk about the Value Toolkit, one of the principal tools within the Value Toolkit is that value definition framework. It sets out across a capitals approach those things that might be important to clients and to their stakeholders, and just helps them to consider as broad a range as possible. So I often talk about bandwidth. How do we broaden our bandwidth, if you like, in terms of the issues that we can possibly consider? Because this is like a high, kind of giant Jenga set. When you push one thing, something comes out the other side, and sometimes actually the whole thing falls over. How do we make sure we give clients a view of those sometimes intended consequences, but sometimes unintended consequences too? How do we make a balanced decision? Because we can't have it all. And of course, this is about optimization within constraints. So we'll always have some kind of budget constraint. We'll always have some kind of time constraint or labor constraint, whatever it is. But how do we optimize value within those constraints as best as we possibly can? And that all starts with a clear definition of what really matters to the client in the first place.
Okay, so I'm going to jump in with I've got some more questions, but I may as well try and weave some of the audience questions that are now starting to come in thick and fast as we're going. So the first one that we've had come through here is, who's the primary audience for the toolkit? Is it construction firms? Is it the government? Is it investors? And also, is there any plans for this to sort of be, exported as British expertise looking forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a very good question. So first and foremost, the Value Toolkit is something that needs to be facilitated. So we've created this process, this suite of tools and loads of guidance, and predominantly it's to support clients in, as I say, defining value and building it into their projects. But of course, in doing that, we have to interact with a huge number of people. So the idea is to create a common language and a common process that all parts of that supply chain involved in that project or program, so they're speaking the same language and they can respond to it. So to pick up the international point, so yes, predominantly this is aimed at the construction or the built environment sector. It's predominantly aimed at helping clients, but of course we know we need to have the professionals to facilitate that process. But we also see an interest in the international market. These are not challenges we face alone, of course. So we're really keen to make sure we share that expertise across other countries and potentially across other sectors too. Again, this idea of making value-based decisions isn't just restricted to the built environment sector and built environment products. This is a whole shift in the way that we think across the globe.
Brilliant. And I suppose what you're saying there links into another question that we've had come through about how, sorry. So this shift in thinking, has there been a lot of thought into how to tackle like resistance to that, or like an inertia and in the speed of people willing to embrace new ways of doing things, and how to sort of get everyone to make that shift away from lowest cost to best value?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that this principle isn't new. So whether we look at public procurement and the Green Book, this principle has been established for a long time. The problem is the consistency with which people do it. So we've been really pleasantly surprised actually by the massive range of both clients and practitioners across the supply chain that are already thinking in this way, and they already really want to embrace this approach. The difficulty is that no matter how many people come to us and say that they're already doing elements of this, they're all doing it differently. They all follow different processes, they have different language. It makes it extremely challenging for the supply chain to be able to respond consistently. And to pick up an earlier point that I made, just to be able to think in value terms is one thing, unless we change our actual approach to delivery such that it accommodates a value-based approach, an outcome-based approach, we're unlikely to actually leverage those benefits. So as I say, really pleasantly surprised by the amount of kind of drive and appetite for this. I think it's massively accelerated over the last year or so. I think policy has accelerated quite significantly as well. So really encouraged. We will never be able to bring everyone on the journey at the same speed. But also, just again, to pick up another point I made before, we're not trying to tell any client what value is. We're trying to help them to be clear in what they define by value and then to follow that through in the project or process. So they can be as light touch in some respects as they want to be.
Brilliant. Okay. So I suppose something that we did touch on there was, how these are not unique challenges to the UK and that sort of thing. And obviously it's a time where global challenges are impacting all levels of sector across the board. How is the Value Toolkit going to better enable, let's start with UK business, to tackle those global challenges?
Yeah, I think I'll take a slightly different, I suppose, answer to the question. So this idea that these challenges are not unique to the UK is really important. So if you look across the 150 plus, and it's quite a much bigger number than that now, of experts we've been working with, many of those experts actually work across the international space anyway. So a particularly important piece of work around the Value Toolkit was the work we've done around the capitals approach. And we've worked with an organisation called the Capitals Coalition to understand how the capitals approach helps us to look at both our impacts, so how we can positively and negatively impact on things like human capital, social capital, but also our dependencies. So how do we think about the things we depend on and whether we should value them accordingly? So a really good example of that, we clearly depend very heavily on labour, but we don't always treat it or value it as such. How do we make sure that we're keeping it in good condition and skilled and trained so that it's still there in 10 years' time when we need it? And we know we've struggled with that. So that impacts dependencies thing's really important. But the reason I mention that is that the capitals approach is an internationally recognised approach. So the Capitals Coalition have been working with economies across the globe, and we seem to be seeing some convergence, I guess, in the way that we talk about value and the capitals. So it was really important for us to build on that approach so that it is transferable to other parts of the globe.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Another question we've had come in circling, I'm just going to jump in with these where they sort of connect to what we were just talking about before we move on too far. So you were talking about how, this gives a standardized approach as opposed to people doing a bit of this and a bit of that. It provides industry with a standard. But how are we actually going to ensure there is a standard approach? How are we going to ensure that there is adoption? Is there a key commitment from certain regulators or certain clients that are going to help ensure that we start seeing this rolled out on a mass scale once the pilot phase and whatnot is done?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, really good question. So one of the strongest or a couple of strong things that happened along the journey. So the first one was the CLC's roadmap to recovery. So there was explicit reference to the Value Toolkit within there, and making sure that as part of our recovery plan that we committed to the Value Toolkit. That was really where we started to gain some significant momentum back in July of last year. But of course, we've then seen the construction playbook land. So I'm really pleased that we've been involved in the development of the construction playbook. And again, that the playbook references specifically the Value Toolkit as one of the things that we want the industry to embrace and clients to embrace, to be able to drive some of the ambitions that are set out in there. So this is something that is quite heavily embedded now in both the kind of consciousness of the industry, but also in those kind of key policy documents too. So this is not about kind of mandating it. It's about pointing to a process that a huge number of people have contributed to. And of course, it will never be finished in some respects. This is something that once we've tested it, we'll get it to the best possible state we can and we'll start to use it. But of course, over time, things change, things improve. And I'm really pleased that all along, this has not been a reinvention of the wheel. This has been grabbing the bits of best practice that exist across the sector, across different clients and across different parts of industry, to be able to bring together an approach that everybody can buy into. So this is not saying that people didn't do this. It's saying that people, if you actually put all that together, you come up with something that's really quite special.
Brilliant. So someone else has just asked a question on the construction playbook and how it interacts with the toolkit. So they've asked, is the Value Toolkit designed to complement or provide guidance in the application of the playbook?
Yeah, so we're working with the playbook team. So as the playbook rolls out, we're at a very similar point with the Value Toolkit, which is great. But there are a few really key touch points in there. So again, the playbook is trying to drive value-based and outcome-based decision making. So there's an explicit reference to say, the best way to do that is to look at the Value Toolkit as a process. There are other elements and touch points around risk again, and moving into that different way of looking at risk. And there are also, when I mentioned the client approach element of the Value Toolkit, this idea of selecting the right delivery model for the type of client you are, for the type of project you're trying to deliver, and of course, the type of value you're after. Again, there are 2 or 3, 4, in fact, touch points in the playbook which say, okay, this is what we want to achieve. These are the principles behind it. If you want practical advice on how to go about doing it, then of course, go and check out the Value Toolkit. So I'm really pleased with that strong link there.
Brilliant. We've had this question come in a few times, and I know we're going to circle back to this, but I may as well get it out there for the first time right now. So questions along the lines of how do we get hold of the tools to use them, essentially, is the one that we've had about 10 times already. So
No, that can only be a good thing and a nice problem to have. So if I go back to part of the previous question that you mentioned about how do we make sure this is a standardized approach, a big part of that is making sure we've got a proper training regime around it. So what we were absolutely sure we didn't want to do, and what all of the partners in the program were telling us consistently, was we didn't want to create something that we then just threw at clients and we threw at the industry and said, you know, help yourselves and get on with it. We needed to make sure we were developing a training regime that actually supported people to be able to do it properly, because we know it's, you know, some of these conversations, some of these activities the Value Toolkit sets out are not easy. They are going to require a different mindset, and they're going to require different people in the room, as I said. So in terms of how we're rolling this out, and you're right, we'll come back to this, I guess, as we go through the piece, but as we move into this new exciting testing and piloting phase, we have two waves of testing effectively. So we've got all those partners I've mentioned who are already starting to sign up and are all raring to go to start to try this on live projects and programs. But also what we've opened today, if you visit the website, is a portal for people to register their interest. The reason we're doing it that way, rather than just putting all the tools out there to use, is because we want to make this testing period as informative as possible. We want structured feedback from those people testing it. We want to work with them directly to train them, to give them the tools that they need and show them how to use it. And if we were just to put it all out there for people to try, that we might lose that consistency. So this isn't a huge amount of time. And again, we're not restricting the people that can sign up anyway. We've got a first wave of the people that have been involved. And we've got a really important second wave then of people that have never seen it before. And of course, that's where we really start to get a feel for how easy this is to use, whether we need to fine tune the language, whether the tools are right. So that's the best place to start. Get to the website, register your interest. The best thing you can do is to bring a project or a client with you, or if you're a client, of course, to bring that project and to express some interest in trying the tools on it.
And just for everyone who is listening, we will be sharing that link with the entire audience towards the end of the presentation today, just so that everyone has the opportunity to listen to Ron now and then jump over there and sign up if they've got a project they think would be good for the testing program. Someone has asked, out of this like early adopters program, what are some of the key things I think you've outlined a few there, but are there any other sort of like key criteria that you're hoping to achieve through this testing program?
Yeah.
Ahead of launch. No, continue.
Yeah, so I think it's one of the things that's most important is we recognize that in 6 months, we're very unlikely to be able to take a project from its earliest possible stage to being built out. Yeah, there may be small projects that we can do that with. So what we need to do is we need to get the biggest range of projects and the biggest range of clients possible. So just to reiterate something I said earlier, the Value Toolkit is applicable, yes, to public sector because we've got drives like the construction playbook, but it's also applicable to the private sector. It's applicable to buildings, it's applicable to infrastructure, and so on and so forth. It is just a process for how we think about and how we make decisions. So really the most critical thing is to get that broad range of projects. So don't assume we're looking for huge projects. Don't assume we're looking for buildings or infrastructure. Bring us different projects. Bring us things that are looking at decommissioning, for example. How do we make the right decisions around how we do decommission assets, for example? So range is the right answer, getting that range of projects and programs to test.
Cool, okay. And then another question we've had here about the sort of training program. How exactly is that going to be? Obviously, you've said that you want to work closely with the people who are adopting to make sure there's a standardized approach and it's not just being like, here, take it and figure it out for yourselves. But how is that going to be rolled out? And will there also be continued rollout once the product's actually launched? Will there still be that, with the broader market, will there still be those training programs in place?
Yeah, so I think in the short term, we already have an awareness training course ready to go. And again, if you go to the website, there's a place to sign up for that awareness training. It gives you a very high level view of what the toolkit is, those streams that I mentioned, the kind of phases of the process. What we'll be doing through this testing phase is really building that detailed training regime. So we have a huge wealth of guidance material that have been developed by the team over the last 9 months. So every stream has a very detailed handbook to it that explains how to do it and explains how to use the tools. But we won't get to the final kind of training regime until we've tried that, of course. We need to understand what level of support people need. And that will, of course, differ between different practitioners and different clients as well. So right now we have that kind of high level awareness training, but we need the next 6 months to understand what that training regime really looks like. What we're absolutely sure about is by the time we get to the end of this calendar year and the Value Toolkit goes live for people to see, there will need to be something to demonstrate that you've been through that process, something to say, you know, I've done the right training, I can go to a client. And critically, the client is going to get the Value Toolkit. They're not going to get some version of it, if you like. And again, that's how we're going to try and drive that consistency.
And something that you've touched on there is how will that then be, so obviously it's helping the client establish their initial definitions of value and how the best way about achieving those are, but how does that then apply throughout the supply chain? How is it then that, what are the ramifications for those further down the chain than at the top?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because ramifications almost suggests a negative.
I don't mean it in a negative way, but
it's fine.
I mean,
I do the same. So for the supply chain, this is a huge opportunity, of course. So as I said before, we've all worked for organizations that have fantastic solutions on the shelf, but they're just that little bit more expensive, or that frankly, they just do more than they need to do because we've been given a very prescriptive view of what the solution needs to be. So the opportunity for the supply chain, again, is to be able to be given really, really early sites. And of course, in the playbook, we encourage, early contractor, early supplier involvement in those conversations. And the Value Toolkit does exactly the same. The earlier we can get clients to articulate what's important and therefore what the decision-making structure is going to be, the earlier the supply chain can go off and find these innovative solutions and these value-driven solutions. So the opportunity is quite significant, and the opportunity also to embrace new ways of, in terms of commercial strategy and business models. I think there are different ways now coming in which lend themselves to a more value outcome-based approach. But I suppose the challenges associated with this are particularly around data. So how do we make sure the supply chain has the right data to be able to prove that the solutions and the systems and the services they're offering will actually leverage the benefits the client's after? And again, the common language really helps with that because it means that you're not having to answer lots and lots of different tender requests, for example, different information, different kind of approach to value. But it is a challenge. Do we have that rich data to say exactly where materials are coming from, exactly the embodied carbon of those materials, or who was employed to make them? We're not going to get there overnight, but we're talking about a much richer data set now that the supply chain needs to have to hand to be able to answer a much broader set of questions from the client.
So there is a question about data and whether this will sort of enable the sharing of best practice by the platform. Is that something that it's going to do, or is it going to be open source data, or is it still going to be restricted depending on who the client is?
Yes, I think we're still working through that. So when I talk about the tools that sit within the Value Toolkit, there are the kind of, I suppose, standalone tools almost, things that supports particular activities, whether that be, forms or spreadsheets or, templates, whatever it is, mathematical models and Excel documents. There's a whole kind of range of tools. But then, as I suppose is implied in the question, we're also developing a web application. Now, it's very important to say this is a publicly funded for industry by industry initiative. Yeah. And we've developed a beta web application to make sure that they have the tools they need to be able to do the Value Toolkit process. Of course, the challenge with that is exactly as the question suggests, is how much of that data can we start to aggregate, and where does that data sit, and who owns it, and all those kind of tricky questions. And again, the testing period is very much about that. So we're working with government, for example, to understand, how can we aggregate some of that data? The thing I'm really excited about is this idea of being able to have a view of how decisions are really being made in practice. And how we can actually communicate back to policy whether people are really taking seriously the policy objectives, I suppose, that they have. So we're still working through that. The intention is absolutely for that app to be free to access. Absolutely no problem with that. We just need to work out the ins and outs of where that data sits and who has access to it. So again, that's what this period will hopefully help us to answer.
And brilliant. And so something else that keeps sort of coming up is how it's good. We have discussed certain government policy around the construction playbook and procurement and that sort of thing. But there's obviously a lot of other government policy that, delivering on the net zero agenda and, helping to build back better, or, major infrastructure projects, or a whole host of things that are broader government policy that construction is involved in. How is this Value Toolkit going to actually help industry turn policy into action, I suppose?
No, absolutely. I mean, it's absolutely clear, Jordan, from the conversations we've been having with clients now consistently for the last 9 months or so, that it's becoming increasingly difficult, particularly for public sector clients, to navigate the plethora of policy that kind of surrounds them. And one of the additional challenges is that the different levels of policy. So some are aimed specifically at the built environment. Some, of course, are much, much broader than that. Yeah. What's increasingly challenged for those clients is when we're talking about a specific project, we are refurbishing an office building or refurbishing a school or whatever it is, or building a new one. How do we translate all of that really quite high level strategy and policy into something meaningful they can do on that specific project or program? So again, a big part of the early element for Toolkit is about how we take all of that kind of national policy, organizational policy and strategy, regional policy. How do you boil all that down? how do you take the context of the project you're actually trying to deliver and come up with some meaningful outcome statements that reflect that project? If you take net zero as an example, we all know that there's a massive policy and global objective to move towards zero carbon. But what does that mean for a specific project, which is, for example, renewing a part of the railway line? What can they do on that particular project, both in the delivery of it and in the operation of it, to contribute to that net zero ambition? So I think it's that translation piece is really important. Again, is quite difficult. So the toolkit helps with that, helps to boil that through. And we're not just talking about public sector clients, of course. In the private sector, the increasing role of the SG raises exactly the same question. There are larger expectations on clients now to make, I don't want to say better, but to make different, to make more rounded decisions on how they invest their money.
Yeah, and on that point, I suppose we've had a lot of questions coming through about different aspects of how this works with procurement and existing procurement models. And I know that's something that you've already touched on, but if maybe you could outline a little bit how you envisage how the hub sort of envisages this working, helping with procurement issues, that would be really helpful. I think that we literally have had probably about 30 different procurement questions come through, and I'm sort of trying to package them up because it sounds like we could do a whole webinar just on the value toolkit and procurement, but I want to be able to talk about a few other things as well.
No, it absolutely makes sense. I mean, this is something that comes up. So as many of you know, we've been hugely fortunate to have Anne Bentley as one of the champions of the Value Toolkit, been working very, very closely on it. The Value Toolkit is first and foremost a decision support tool. It helps clients to have the right information to be able to answer certain decisions. So as I mentioned, the earliest possible decision, do we need to build anything in the first place? That's a scary concept for somebody that operates in the built environment, of course, but it's the right question. All the way through to what's the most viable option based on the value I'm trying to deliver? How do I optimize that? And so on and so forth. They're the questions that the Value Toolkit tries to answer. When we get to the what I call the kind of procurement transaction, of course, what the Value Toolkit is doing is bringing all of that kind of quality element, the additional kind of non-core benefits, I guess, of what we're trying to do, and to give that as supplementary information to somebody who's trying to make a decision. However, we have just started a series of workshops looking at how closely and how directly the Value Toolkit can support the client in making that procurement decision, that tender decision, if you like. So I'm really pleased to see Anne Bentley is going to be leading further work on that through the next few months to understand exactly what role the Value Toolkit will play in that specific decision. But like I say, this is predominantly about decision support and about helping the client to have the right information to make the decision.
Brilliant. And on that point, there's been a couple of questions here around in terms of like obviously it's a publicly funded project, and the sort of level of adoption that you're seeing from government clients as a client. Is there something that you've seen? We've already spoken about how there are a number of key departments that have already started using the toolkit, but is it something that's been looked at by organisations like the NIC and that sort of thing? Is that part of where the toolkit is going to sit, or is that something that you're still working on through this testing phase?
Yeah, so it's a bit of both. So we've been working very closely with the Infrastructure and Projects Authority all along. That gives us already got a good kind of hook. And in fact, the IPA have been chairing our client advisory group, as we call it. So we have got really strong commitment from across the government Whitehall departments, but also with devolved nations as well. Really important to make sure we don't restrict this to kind of Whitehall, if you like. And then into some of the ALBs, for example, too. And of course, then into the private sector. And one of the really interesting bits as well has been kind of regional frameworks and local authorities and how so we really have covered the kind of breadth of things. But that buy-in from the top, particularly supported by the IPA, has been really useful. Again, not in trying to use this as a stick and say that you must do it, but to try and say, we know that we're on this trajectory, we know we have these policy imperatives and we have to move in this direction. We've now created something to really help you in a practical way. And something that's really important to note, Jordan, as well, this isn't an additional process. This shouldn't be an additional burden on top of the processes public sector clients are already going through particularly. So if you look at the Green Book, this is supposed to help clients to deliver on the ambitions of the Green Book that already exist. It isn't creating additional burden.
Brilliant. Okay. And so I suppose you and I have spoken about this previously because we've done another webinar on the toolkit. And so I had a few questions about like how things you've said that you got the directive to speed up with the pandemic, how things sort of have shifted in that period. We've had a few questions about like the sort of insights and whatnot that you think have been really important to driving this project forward over the past year.
Yeah, I think, like I said, I'd probably go back to this kind of increasing policy landscape. So if you look at the things that have landed just in the last year or so, we've been doing this. This agenda has only got more and more and more intense, and I think we've seen clients really start to struggle with it. And as we've done some of the workshops around key bits of the value toolkit, around value definition, and so on and so forth, we've seen them start to say, okay, this is what we need. We need something that's a bit more practical, that's a bit more kind of step by step. And one of the biggest challenges has been getting the right people in the room. So to have some of these very broad-ranging conversations around value, you need quite a different mix of people. So one of the things they've struggled with is again, you've got a policy team that have promised to deliver certain things. You've got a delivery team that, of course, have then got to turn that into something. And that often that chasm between those two roles is quite evident. So again, trying to get those people in the right room has been really interesting. But I don't think we've seen a significant change in, I think the appetite has been there from the start. What we've seen is people consistently adding to that list of people I've mentioned. So I keep mentioning the numbers of experts we've had involved. It's not an exaggeration. Week by week, we've had people saying we want to get involved. We've got something to offer. We want to try it out. And again, those clients have been there for the long haul too. I think the difference as we move into this testing phase is that to date we've been trying bits of the process on hypothetical projects, on retrospective projects. We're now saying, okay, we are about to build this, or we're about to roll out this program of work. Let's use the Value Toolkit to make sure we're embedding value-based decision making. That's the big difference here. So it's not that we've not tested it at all. It's that this is an entirely different process.
We've literally just had a question that picks up on part of that point, and it's we've been testing bits and pieces here and there. Is that a way that the toolkit can be used in reality, or does it only make sense to be used in its entirety, really? Like, can you pick certain modules and apply them to a project, or do you think that, you really want to be using the whole program as it's designed?
Yeah, so that's another great question. So I think there are elements of it that have to be done. So, we've spoken a lot on this call about value definition. Of course, when I mentioned the 5 streams, there's a whole lot more to the value toolkit than that, but that's the kernel. Everybody have to start with that to understand what they mean by value and to roll that out. I also mentioned the ability to use the value toolkit at a kind of portfolio level. Now, of course, the value toolkit process sets out a kind of journey along a project or program, but there are some really key elements of it, particularly around things like client profile. So for those of you who aren't aware or haven't in the last few hours read the overview document, the client profile is about understanding who the client is, how they currently work with the market, where they should play a role and where maybe they shouldn't. But equally, it's about the client they want to be. So how do we work with that client over time to build them into a client that actually can embrace these kind of value-based approaches, outcome-based approaches more wholly? So I think the answer, and slightly political answer, I guess, is yes, there are certain elements you can kind of pick and choose. But the strength of this is when you start with a clear definition of value, you understand how you're going to measure and compare things, you develop your commercial strategy and delivery model around it, you embrace a risk approach that is about broader value. When you bring it all together, that's where the strength is. One of the questions we've had quite often is there a value toolkit light? This is a small project. Actually, it seems like a lot of work to do for such a small project. That's something we're looking at. And again, in the testing process, we will find out whether there are some really key bits that actually have to be done, and other bits that maybe are slightly less, I wouldn't say less important because it's all important, but slightly less instrumental for those smaller projects. So I think these are all things we can play with, Jordan, but I would encourage people to go to the website, to look at that process, to learn the process and understand which bits would work for them and which bits maybe don't, and we'll take that feedback.
And so something that you did just touch on there is scale, in terms of scale of project, but we've had a question come in about scale of client. Is there any limitations around how big or how much work a client needs to have coming down the pipeline for them to need to use the toolkit, or is it applicable for anyone who's a client on any sort of scale of project?
Yeah, it's absolutely applicable. I mean, the principles 100% are applicable to anything. And the reason I gave those rather cheesy analogies was because, you can apply these principles in day-to-day life about how I think we're all trying to do better with that. So there definitely isn't any boundary or limits on it. I think, like I said, I think the interesting thing over the next 6 months is to understand, what's the minimum journey, the critical path almost through the Value Toolkit that everybody should do, and which bits are additional for those bigger projects and programs. But again, we're really hoping to get some feedback on that.
Brilliant. And then, so we've also had some questions about how the toolkit's going to interface with existing processes and technologies. So the idea of how does it play into, the BIM agenda and that sort of thing. Is that all does that all interface, or are they sort of side by side products?
No, so it's really, really important, again, as a program that we are, as a construction innovation hub program, was to make sure that the Value Toolkit becomes something that links things together. So one of the questions we often get is around existing schemes or existing kind of methodologies. So if you think about things like National TOMS or BREEAM or whatever it may be, the Value Toolkit very much points towards those things. So not to go into too much detail, but within the kind of evaluation and measurement space of the Value Toolkit, it doesn't say this is how you will measure things. It says, let's understand how you're measuring things now. Let's understand what you're trying to measure in the first place based on the value definition. And let's see actually what existing access to data do you already have and where are the gaps. So it's really important that it provides that kind of linking piece to say, okay, you're now trying to measure a much broader range of things and trying to make a much broader range of decisions. What actually things are out there already that you can bring together to be able to make those decisions. On the BIM agenda specifically, or probably more in terms of information management, we've got a piece of work just starting this year too to look at the information management flows of the Value Toolkit. So as I said, you're now seeing clients starting to ask if they're using the Value Toolkit for a much broader range of data. And of course, the data you have access to across the different phases of a project will change. In the very early stages, how do we, what sort of data can we actually pull together to give us a view of embodied carbon or of material sourcing, for example? And of course, as you go through, it becomes more and more detailed. So we've got a piece of work that looks at the information requirements effectively of clients, and to make sure that as we start to standardize in that agenda, that we are considering this much broader range of issues in that data.
We've had another question come in here, sort of around, is there a stage where it's too late? Like, is there a stage where if you're already on board with the project, if you're already out to tender, is it too late to start using it? Or is it, is it better to jump in at that point?
Yeah, in many respects, the toolkit is a circular tool. So what we haven't really touched on is the fact that just when you get to the end of the project and you've delivered the thing, the Value Toolkit doesn't stop. The Value Toolkit makes sure that through the process and the operation of that life cycle of that asset, you're continuously revisiting whether it's delivering the outcomes that it needs to. Is it actually still fit for purpose? And of course, what happens in that time is that the client's definition of value may change. The client may change. It may be handed over or bought by somebody else. And of course, policy will change. So things will become more or less important over time. The Value Toolkit is a continuous set of activities to make sure we're revisiting that. And of course, they'll come to a point, and you'll see on the diagram for those of you that go and have a look after this, come to a point where you say, actually, this asset no longer meets the needs that I have. It no longer is delivering the outcomes I want. And you go right back to the start of the process again. Okay, there's a need for an intervention. What is that intervention? What outcomes am I trying to drive? And the whole thing goes again. So of course, we encourage people to use it as early as possible, but it by no means you can't go back and reflect on what you've done so far and reflect and kind of predict what you're going to do going forwards.
And something that we have spoken about is that you were saying, part of the reason that this testing is being done the way it is because the hub wants to have that close interaction with those people who are testing it to make sure there's a standard approach and also that you can get the feedback that you need and want. So what sort of level of interaction is there between the hub and, well, I mean, not is there, because I suppose this is something that's launching today. So is there plan to be between the hub and those people who are the early adopters and then, in the second phase of testing as well, once the project is actually live and in practice, in terms of how things are delivering against plan to in reality?
Yeah, and I think this is exactly, you picked up there on the kind of two waves of testing that I mentioned. This is a big part of the reason why, of course, we wanted to give first mover advantage to those that have been actively involved and to thank them for all of the input they've given. But also, they're the ones that know it the best. But they've all worked on different parts of it. Some people have been, I suppose, so involved they know the majority of it, but no one knows the whole thing together at this stage. So when we put them into a room and we give them all the tools and they know them quite well and we get them to use them, we'll start to get an impression for what level of support they will require on a sort of longer term basis. By the time, therefore, we get to the second wave with people who've probably never touched or seen these tools, we'll have a better idea of how much to support them. Because this isn't just the hub, of course. This is the hub working with a huge number of external partners to bring together this thing, and it will continue to be that collaborative through this testing period. So I think it's hard to say on the level of support people will require. I have great confidence in the people we have in this sector. We've got some amazing firms and businesses, both within the project and outside of it. But we're going to do everything we can to support them through this process.
So some of the agendas that we have touched on in terms of how the toolkit ties into, obviously the building back better and the green agenda and net zero. But obviously for construction, there's also the, safety and competence is obviously also a big key. And we've had a few questions coming in as to whether that sort of idea about, the golden thread and whatnot ties into the toolkit as well.
Yeah, so absolutely does, Jordan. I mean, what the toolkit doesn't do is it doesn't ask a client whether safety is important.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to kind of get that, just to get that down. So the toolkit assumes that when an option comes to the table, it is compliant and that it's following all the regulations and all the rest of it. And that's not to kind of shirk responsibility. It's just not the role of the toolkit. But when we talk about golden thread, there is a really interesting and important link here. So particularly when we talk about the web application we touched on briefly earlier, this idea of having all of these decision points and these conversations actually written down gives us the opportunity to see when things change. We've all worked on projects, and certainly know I have, where value is consistently eroded as you go through the project journey. We have fantastic ambitions at the start. We want everything. The client wants everything you can possibly get. Of course, as we go through, that value starts to erode, and we know that when we talk about value engineering, it's often used probably not in the spirit that it's intended. This idea of having this kind of this transparent record of how decisions were made and why certain materials or why certain approaches were chosen, I think does link into that agenda, because it means that it's very difficult to suddenly come along and make a change on the basis of cost without justifying why that change has been made in the first place. So to recap, the Value Toolkit doesn't try and look at safety and say how important safety is, but it certainly provides another form of evidence, another golden thread of value that I call it, and I don't use that term lightly, to link together why decisions are being made, who made them, when they were made, and in what setting.
Of course, no, that makes a lot of sense. And on that note, sort of about like, who's involved when, that openness and that transparency, which is obviously something that construction has in the past faced some challenges with. We've had a few questions coming through. So you've already discussed the opportunities for the supply chain with this, but people have been asking, as part of the supply chain, that, this toolkit is going to be out there, clients are going to be using it. Is there an opportunity for contractors or consultants or whoever else in the supply chain to sort of, see what they're going to need to be delivering on ahead of time, see what they need to be doing as a business to make sure their offering is matching what the toolkit is going to be asking for? Like, can they get that opportunity to prepare, I suppose?
Yeah, 100%. So this isn't just that we're going to deal with clients and practitioners and leave the supply chain to come to their own conclusions. We've done a significant amount of work through Construction Excellence with the supply chain to help them to prepare. So for example, we had, and this is something that's going to be published, we had a series of points of things that they need to consider and be aware of. And the data one was one I mentioned to you earlier about how you can make sure you're ready when those questions start to come. For those forward-thinking suppliers, they will already have that information to hand. They'll already have, like I say, those innovative solutions on the shelf, and they're just waiting for somebody to ask the right questions. So I think I'm really positive, but yeah, we'll continue to do that work. Again, Construction Excellence have been a huge support in reaching out to the supply chain, helping them to prepare and getting their feedback. One of the biggest challenges is language. So again, we're aware that when you introduce something like this, to try and keep the language so that it's not an entirely new vocabulary for everybody. There are challenges to that, because how do we bring together what is already quite a disparate kind of language base into something consistent? So it will take time. The awareness training that I mentioned is available for everybody, whether you're a client, whether you're a supplier, whether you're a student who's just coming into the sector. The whole idea of that is to keep it at a level where people understand what it is, why it means something to them, and what they might need to go and do off the back of it.
Brilliant. And so then in terms of now, we're talking today because there's the launch of the testing, and we've talked about some of the objectives and that sort of thing, but between now and the end of the year, what should the industry be doing to get ready, in your opinion?
So of course, I would say go and sign up. So get involved. I think the sooner we get people to start to touch and feel these tools and to start to try them, we're after feedback. We're not just trying to kind of push it through. The reason we've dedicated a specific period of time to testing is because we want that feedback. So I think there's that. So get involved. I think particularly around that, some of the I suppose more innovative parts of this. So if you think about the value definition framework, start to become familiar with the language. As I said, this isn't a UK thing. This is now a global movement towards what is the 4 capitals approach. And there are tens of thousands of organizations now that have been in conversation about how we drive consistent language around capitals and what's important to us. So I would definitely start to familiarize yourself with that. So there's a whole load of things you go. I hope the website provides some of those resources. But again, we're here to support. If there are things that people want support with or specific things that we're struggling with, we will accommodate that and we'll build that into our program. And
I mean, we've talked broadly about value and the idea that, value is more than cash in the bank or, the end, like monetary value of an asset. And obviously social value is a topic that becomes so much more recently with everything that's been announced policy-wise. So how does this sort of play into firms existing? Do you think it will work alongside firms' existing social value policy, or do you think firms need to sort of like look at their social value policy, and could this help them actually develop it?
So I think it's both. Quite good timing actually, because there was an article Social Value UK, one of our partners, published yesterday or the day before, around how this its interfaces with the social value agenda. Of course, we know that the definition of social value has become quite broad. And again, the capitals approach starts to kind of break that down a little bit, but I think it's both. So I mentioned about, one of the earliest possible points of the Value Toolkit is translating all of that kind of policy and strategy into meaningful action. And organizational strategy and things like social value policies are a part of that. So if you've already done a huge amount of work as an organization to define what social value means to you and what your contribution to it's going to be, that needs to be translated into every decision you make. That's the whole point of what we're trying to do here. But equally, if you're an organization that are trying to develop policy in that space, again, that value definition framework will help you to do that, will help you to consider a much broader range of issues that have been agreed by, I think we're talking about 70 experts alone, just developing that value definition framework. And again, it's version 1.0 because it will evolve and it will change over time, but it gives you a really good, strong starting point. So I think it's both, if that's not a cop-out answer.
No, not at all. I think that's a good answer. And I think that's, different businesses and different organizations are at different points in the journey. And if it can support people at both points, I think, that's obviously what you're after, isn't it? It's, something, not a one size fits all approach, which is important when you're talking about an industry that's as varied and divergent as construction can be. On that point, I suppose, about how divergent the industry can be, are there plans in place to sort of help ensure the implementation of the toolkit is standardized by clients, like when it goes more widespread, so that you don't have 4 different clients using the toolkit with the same supply chain, the supply chain still having to do 4 different things? I mean, obviously there will be 4 different things, but that there is some sort of conformity and standardization there.
No, absolutely. It's really important. I don't think we would have done our job if and again, that's the point I was making earlier, that, why haven't we just published it all and given everybody the tools overnight? Well, because that will happen. You'll see that divergence and you'll see people interpret those tools and that guidance in different ways. So I think everything's still on the table at the moment. We think one of the things that the Hub has to do, part of our grant funding agreement, is to leave a governance structure to support the things that we create. So we've had a really strong governance structure through the process so far. What we need to do come the kind of go live date at the end of this year is to leave a legacy governance structure to look after the toolkit and to continue to refine it, because we're absolutely adamant this needs to be something that continues to be a collaboration between clients and industry, not something that suddenly kind of disappears overnight. And of course, that's very hard to happen now with it being so enshrined in things like the playbook. But I don't think we quite know yet, again, until we've done this testing, what that regime needs to look like. So is it some kind of accreditation? Again, we don't want to make this too heavy. We want to keep things free to access and all the rest of it. So I think there are some big considerations here, but the point made in the question is a really important one. We've been working with clients for the last 9 months, telling them that we're bringing some consistency to this process. If we suddenly have multiple practitioners with different ways of doing it, then we will struggle. What we do recognize, though, is that people will take these tools and they'll improve them and they'll find, they'll develop their own web apps and things off the back of it. As long as the core principles of the process remain, and as long as we have a core tool set that remains free to access, I don't think we should discourage that. I think we should be encouraging people to innovate on top of what we've done.
Of course. And I mean, I suppose that's, one of the things that is part of this testing phase is to see how it actually works in practice, what people do once they're handed the tools with live projects and how that all interlinks together. On that point, people have been asking, I know that it's something that you did cover, but maybe if we could just reiterate for the audience, because we've had a few questions about it. With this testing phase, is there any sort of project that you don't want, or is it you want as a wide a variety as possible?
I feel like people are really trying to get me to put them off.
Well, we've just had, is this sort of project okay? Is this sort of project okay? Is this sort of project okay? So I thought a more concise way of asking that is just to say, is there any that aren't okay?
I don't think so. No, I think, like I say, a big part of the point of this is to understand how broadly applicable this is, and that was the brief. Again, because it's an approach. So I'm trying to rack my brains to try and think of something that would really be disappointing if it was brought to me, and I'm struggling. I mean, we addressed the point earlier about how how early or late to come to the process, you will certainly get more out of the tools, and you will certainly be able to test more of it, obviously the earlier you are in the process. But I still don't think that precludes people from trying it. So I think I'm going to stick to my guns. I can't think of any immediately that would worry me.
And in terms of, obviously on that point, you're saying that, it's not just for buildings, it's not just for infrastructure, it's not just for decommissioning, it's for a host of, retrofit, whatever we're talking about. In terms of when it's a program of work, if you're talking about, whether it's a massive government program of work or whether it's a house builder who wants to employ one contractor to do, roofing across 2 estates or whatever we're talking about, how does the approach differ then compared to if it's a single project from the implementation of the tool?
Yeah, we've had some really interesting conversations, particularly with central departments, about this kind of project-program relationship. So there is a view that the idea of applying the Value Toolkit at a program level is to try and drive some consistency again, sorry, to how we make decisions on a program of work. So how do you set a kind of high level, what we call a value profile for a program of work? So let's say, hypothetically, a program of schools. How do we make sure that all of the schools that are being built are delivering broadly on the value ambitions of Department for Education and the stakeholders that it represents? However, there is an acceptance that, particularly for a national program like that, value changes depending on where you are in the UK and depending on the specific site on which those schools are going. So this idea of giving some consistency, for example, in the metrics that are used to measure things, versus the flexibility to recognise that actually local value drivers will vary, in terms of the importance of local labour and how that shifts from north to south, and even its availability, that has to be taken into account. So again, one of the things we're looking to test, and we've done a fair bit of work on this already, is to try at both of those levels in the application, and then to see how they work together. So is it a case of creating a value profile, setting your kind of your outcomes and your values and weighting them with some flexibility that then delivery teams can work within those boundaries, if you like. So we're still working that out, and I think that will be different for different clients. Some clients want to be quite direct about what that looks like and how things will be measured and the outcomes they're trying to drive. Others want to give quite a lot of flexibility to the delivery teams. So I think it will vary again, and we need to be cognizant of that and allowing that flexibility.
Brilliant. With only a few minutes to go, I sort of wanted to ask you, Ron, if you could leave people with a big takeaway from today's discussion that you want them to, really take away from this conversation. Is there anything in particular that stands out to you? Is there something that, is really important that our audience knows today?
I think I want people to absolutely smash this conversation, to be having these conversations with their colleagues, with their clients, with their supply chains, whatever it is. And again, to start to use some of that consistent language and test it. Of course, my biggest ask is that you go and interact with the resources we've got on the website, even if you're not planning to sign up. Download the new overview document, gives you a really kind of good level view of what the toolkit is and why you should care about it effectively. So please do go and do that. But get involved. We want to try and demonstrate that the work we've done has good reach and has enthusiasm and has support, and but also has feedback. And there will be constructive criticism. We need that. We need to understand which bits we need to improve. So they're my two things. Start to have those conversations, particularly for those of you that have clients that you feel are less willing or need to be taken on the journey somewhat. Start to have those conversations to understand if they are on that journey and where they are on that journey. I think that's the way we keep this at the top of the agenda, because this really has risen to the top in terms of the things that people are talking about and how we want this sector to move across, because it's exciting. One of the things I didn't touch upon, yes, this is about driving better social, environmental, economic outcomes, but it's actually about a more sustainable model for our industry and for our sector. I've always been in the construction sector from the age of 15. And I'm really excited this gives us the opportunity for those, and I think about myself in the design office, being able to put forward solutions that are different and that deliver better value, not where I've been prescribed what it is I'm going to draw, and I'm just basically looking for the lowest cost option of doing it. So it's a really exciting opportunity for the sector to move away from its kind of low productivity, low profit margin even model that we're stuck in right now.
Yeah, it's about a healthier sector from every aspect, not just ESG, not just financial, but for everything.
I think people expect better, Jordan. So one of the things that I haven't mentioned is around new entrants to our sector. We know that we struggle to attract talent, and part of the problem for that is that as people come through college or through school, through university, they expect different now. They expect to work for organisations that are making more conscious decisions, that are doing the right thing. We can no longer hide behind anything. we need to start to demonstrate that we're a sector that takes value seriously.
I completely agree. I think, the idea of, wanting to make things a better place to work and a better built environment for everyone who uses it is a really key thing to attracting new people into the sector.
And there are a few sectors in which you can have that level of impact.
Exactly. So I guess I better wrap things up there. We've still got plenty of questions coming in, and we'll try and get all those questions sent through to the appropriate people after this conversation is over. But I just want to thank Ron so much for your time, because I can see the feedback and I can see that the people have really enjoyed your insights. So thank you so much.
No, thanks.
I'm also just going to letting the audience know, I've just sent out to all of you the link where you can find where you can sign up for the Value Toolkit testing. So please go there with your projects and your clients and register your interest and get involved, because it sounds like it'll be a great program to be involved with and one that we'll be following closely. I'd also just like to thank the Construction Innovation Hub for facilitating today's conversation, because it's one that we really wanted to have, because we think it's a really important topic. And thank our audience for all their involvement in today's conversation. Finally, I'd just like to say we're running a 2-day conference later this week, Net Zero Live, all about sustainability in the built environment. There'll be it's a Wednesday, Thursday. There'll be webinars across both days, as well as a live blog and lots of other content there to help hopefully facilitate that conversation. So please have a look at our website and get involved with that as well. So once again, thank you to Ron. Thanks so much for joining me today, and thank you to our audience.
Thanks, Jordan. Thanks, everybody.